Relationships between chess players are constantly evolving. The opponent that I played against in this game is named Mikhail Zlotnikov. He's a very solid Russian international master. And he was actually the first international master that I ever beat. I think I was 11 or 12 years old, and it happened in the New York Open a long time ago. And I beat him in a very interesting game that I was very proud of, and that many people came to me and told me that it was an amazing thing that a young boy beat an international master, and he was, of course, very upset about the game. But then, about 2 weeks before I played this game, which you're about to see, I lost to him in a very difficult struggle in the Marshall Chess Club. So when I sat down to play against him in Washington, D.C., in a very large open tournament, I was remembering the game that I had lost only a few weeks before, and I was ready to get some serious revenge. It's very important to be able to rise against an opponent who beat you the last game. If you start from a psychological disadvantage, then you're in trouble. But if you're energized by the loss, if you're ready to rise to the challenge, you have a very good chance. In this game, I did what a romantic might say is a very exciting thing in a chess game. I sacrificed both of my rooks. I want you to notice the patience of my play, even when very far down in material. While I was worse in a mathematical point of view, the quality of my pieces was much better, and I stopped all of his play despite having very little material to do so. He played c4 against me in the first move. In the game in the Marshall, I played e5, which is a classical opening, and it's the English opening. You notice that it's sort of like a Sicilian or with reverse colors, and it's as if white played e4, black played c5, and then black had another move. In this game, I decided not to play this. I played c6, with the idea of transposing into the Moran. He played d4, d5, e3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, knight f3, knight bd7. So in this position, we can begin to feel the plan. I've closed in my bishop on c8, which is often a dangerous thing to do. My idea is to eventually take his pawn on c4, and when he takes back, play the move b7 to b5, slowly take space on the queen side, then to play a6, lock those pawns together, move my bishop to b7, and eventually play c6 to c5, to play a structure, and I use my bishop on the a8 to h1 diagonal. So while right away my bishop is a little bit closed in, later on, my plan is to open it up on a very good diagonal. So my opponent played the move queen c2, which is known as the anti-Moran. The main variation is bishop d3, after which I would take on c4, bishop takes c4. I would play b5, and after bishop d3, I would play a6. My plan, once again, is to play with c5 and open up the game along those lines. So my position is one in which right now it may look cramped for black, but potentially I'm going to bust things open. So I maintain the tension of busting them open later. He played queen c2, a system which slightly improves White's game. If I were to take on c4 now, his bishop would come out without having wasted a tempo coming out on d3 first. I played b6. This may at first be a strange-looking move. My plan is to once again develop my bishop to b7, and eventually to play c6 to c5. The position will explode in the center, and my bishop will be well placed. The idea of this opening is to you take a very solid center and you maintain the flexibility to uncoil. Black, by maintaining the solidity, it may seem cramped at first, but I have always the potential for my position to uncoil on his. I can take on c4 and play b5 and play c5 whatever I want, so my position is one of potential energy. He played the move bishop d3, developing bishop normally. I played bishop b7. He castled, and I played bishop e7. So right now the point is that there's a central tension between my pawn on d5 and his pawn on c4. If he were to trade on d5, and I would take back with my c-pawn, the center would be pretty much symmetrical. Pawn structure, in fact, is symmetrical except for my pawn on b6, and black's position is fine. So he doesn't have really the option of trading on d5. And later on, I may take on c4 and play c5, so my position has a nice dynamism to it. My opponent now played rook b1. And this is a very important moment. Right now, he's challenging me. His plan is to play b2 to b4. If he plays that move, then it'll be very difficult for me later on to play c5 myself, because he's controlling the square more. And if you imagine I were to castle, and then he were to play b4, if I ever play c5, he can take with his b-pawn, and after I play b takes c5, my bishop on b7 hangs to his rook on b1. So his plan when he plays rook b1 is to play b4 and stop my plan of playing c5. But I believe rook b1 is slightly incorrect. and I took advantage of it because I think it's a slightly wasted move, and I played my plan right away. D takes c4, bishop takes c4, c5. So just before he was about to stop my plan, I played it myself. This is a classic example of prophylaxis in chess. My opponent had an idea to stop my own idea, but I stopped his before he was able to complete it. After c5, he played d takes c5, bishop takes c5, and e4. His plan is to take a little bit of space in the center. We've traded a lot of pawns, and we see now that although my bishop on c8 was cramped, now it's quite good in its diagonal. And later on it will be quite powerful. And here we have a moment to discuss. If I challenge him in the center with e5, I weaken the d5 square, which is a very big weakness. He'll be able to play knight c3 to d5 to trade off there and to occupy the central squares very well. If you notice, the difference in the knight positions is that my knight on d7 is much further away from his weak d4 square than his knight on c3 is from my d5 square. It takes him one move to get there, and it takes me 3 moves to get there. Knight b8, knight c6, knight d4. So if I were to play e6 to e5 right away, I would come into some problems because he would immediately be able to occupy the d5 square. But later on, it's going to be something which I want to do. So I want to prepare and then play e6, e5 later on. He played e4, and I played a6, the idea of which is to control the b5 square. This opening is actually quite similar to the structure of the Queen's Gambit Accepted, which I also play with black. The plan being to play a6 and b5, and also to have a rather symmetrical pawn structure, but to slowly take advantage of his queen side. By playing a6, I also stop use pins which you could play by bishop b5 and knight b5. It's very useful to control the b5 square. I decided not to castle immediately, because I would be committing my king to a place where it doesn't necessarily need to be, and he'd be able to begin his kingside attack immediately. Moves like bishop c1 to g5 can come into consideration. He might consider playing e4 to e5. I really don't want to commit myself so quickly. I want to slowly improve my position and only commit later on. a7 to a6 can be described as maintaining the tension. I'm not clarifying my king position until I need to. He played bishop f4. I played rook c8. It's always good to line up your rook with your opponent's queen, and vice versa. Usually, a queen doesn't want to be lined up so much with a rook, because potentially if all those minor pieces were to move, it could turn out very well. And if you look at the position, in fact, black is threatening already to move all the pieces out of the way. If I play b5 and he moves his bishop somewhere, then I play b4, he'll have to move his knight somewhere, and suddenly only my bishop has to move away to expose my rook straight on the queen. Whenever your opponent lines up a rook with your queen, beware, and maybe you should move your queen away, even if it doesn't seem like it can open up immediately. After rook c8, he understood that idea and moved his queen from c2 to e2. A very wise move. Now my rook doesn't have such powerful threats on the c-file. I expanded a little bit on the queen side, b6 to b5. He played bishop back to d3. Now once again, I can castle if I want to, but I don't think it's a very good move, because he has the option of playing e5, and after my knight moves, my h7 pawn will hardly be defended at all, and he'll be able to begin a very large kingside attack. Think about if I play knight g4, he can even play bishop takes h7 check. King takes h7, and then knight g5 check. After the king moves again, he takes my knight on g4. I've lost a pawn, and my king is being attacked very brutally. So a very common theme in semi-open positions is to refrain from castling, not committing your king quite yet. If I were to castle, he'd be able to begin his plan immediately. A lot of the time when you leave your king in the center, what you're trying to do is decide or let your opponent guess as to whether you're going to go kingside or queenside. In this particular position, it's a little bit strange, because my king obviously can't go to the queenside anymore. But what I am doing is I'm slowly improving my position before allowing him to begin an attack. If he begins an all-out attack on my h7 pawn, when my king is still on e8, I'm never going to castle there. And my king could potentially be safer in the center, although I'm aware that a little later on I'm going to castle kingside, as long as nothing too crazy happens. I'm always checking tactically to make sure that everything is alright in terms of my being able to castle later on. And I'm simply improving my position to prepare it. I played h6. Another possibility for me that would be very interesting would be to play the variation knight f6 to h5. his bishop moves, say back to d2, and then queen d8 to c7. It's a very interesting maneuver that was played in a game Smyslov-Kasparov, I believe in 1984, although I'm not sure of the year. The idea is I chased the bishop off of the f4 square, and then I played queen c7, threatening to occupy the f4 square with my knight. It's a very interesting theme to look at. He has to defend once again the f4 square, but if he plays g3, we can consider using a tactical theme that we saw in the first two games that I analyzed against Todd Luna and Katina. I can take on g3, and if h takes g3, queen takes g3. The f2 pawn is pinned. That's a potential attacking theme which I can use to bust open his kingside. Knight h5, his bishop moves, and then queen to c7 is a very interesting idea which I could have played. Instead, I played h7 to h6, which has a number of ideas. For one thing, I take away the g5 square from his bishop or his knight, which could be a useful thing later on. Another thing is that my pawn is no longer on h7 to be a weakness from his bishop on d3, so his idea of e4 to e5 loses some force. And furthermore, I have an aggressive idea of g7 to g5, which I might decide on later on. If I decide not to castle kingside and to attack him on the kingside, this could be useful, but we'll see. After I played h6, he played the move knight to d2, and now his plan becomes clear. He wants to play a2 to a4 to make me move my b5 pawn, and then to occupy the c4 square with his knight. This is a very good position. His knight is then poised to jump into d6. He could play e4 to e5 and take advantage of my dark square weakness right in the center of things. He could even offer a bishop trade later on, his dark square bishop for my dark square bishop, and the game could begin to center around the d6 square. That's his plan, but it's a little far-fetched. By playing knight f3 to d2, what he did is he gave up control of the e5 square. And also, he gave up the potential control of the d4 square. I played e5. He moved his bishop back to g3. And now we can see that I've improved my position slightly from when I was considering playing e5 before. His knight on d2 is further away from the d4 square, so if I were ever to get a knight to d4, it would be excellent for me. And I now have solid control of the d5 square. My bishop and knight control it, and only his pawn on e4 attacks the square. But he still has the useful plan of playing a2 to a4, and then occupying the c4 square. I castled. Now that the center is clarified, and he can't bust it open and attack my king, I castle away. Now he's very safe there. Notice that my patience in deciding when to castle allowed my king to have a lot of safety. There's no way I can dream of a kingside attack anymore, and his play can only come on the queen side. He improved his rook's position, rook f to d1, which brings up a question similar to one I raised earlier. His rook on d1 is now lined up with my queen on d8, but of course there are a lot of pieces in between. His knight on d2, his bishop on d3, and my knight on d7. I had to make a tough decision here, and I chose to play rook f to e8. This has a number of purposes. For one thing, I want to occupy the d4 square with my knight. The plan is knight d7 to b8 to c6 to d4. But I can't really do that because the knight on d7 is tied down to my e5 pawn. Playing rook f8 to e8, I'm further defending my pawn on e5. Also notice that that pawn really limits the scope of his bishop on g3, which doesn't do all that much these days. But white also has a very clear plan. He played a4, b4, knight a2. And here I had to make a very, very difficult decision, and I made an evaluation which came into context many moves later. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, does he have a threat? He does. My pawn on a6 is hanging. From before, we learned that the two key squares of this position are the d5 square and the d4 square. If anyone were to get a knight to occupy those squares, it would be very good. Imagine my knight on d7 suddenly on d4. I'm attacking his queen, and after it moves, my knight is like a bone in his throat, very unpleasant to deal with. But on the other hand, he does have the threat of bishop takes a6. I'll lose a pawn. But if I play a5, it involves some risk. Notice that suddenly all the light squares on the queen side are under his control. If he were to put a bishop on b5, a knight on c4, and a knight on b3, how does the position look to you? It feels like I'm in some big trouble. For one thing, his rook on d1 is very strong on that very difficult file. Another thing, my knight on d7 is pinned to my rook on e8. It's also pinned to my queen on d8 by his rook. His knights on c4 and b3 are both attacking my a5 pawn, which has suddenly become a big weakness. And his knight on b3 is attacking the bishop on c5. And finally, my solid pawn on e5 has become the victim of a very big battery. His knight on c4 and bishop on g3 are bearing down on it. If I allow him to complete his plan, I'll be in big trouble. What should I do? Here I had to decide between playing a6 to a5 and defending with queen on d8 to a5, which also has a threat of its own. But unfortunately, queen a5 loses for tactical reasons. If I play queen a5, I'm defending my pawn on a6 and attacking his pawn on a4. The problem with this move is that he has a very strong plan. He plays knight d2 to c4, attacking my queen. I take on a4. Then he plays b2 to b3, a very important move. He attacks my queen and defends his knight on a2 with his queen on e2. I only have two possible moves, queen b5 and queen c6. If I play queen b5, I'm lining my queen up with his bishop on d3, a very dangerous thing to do, and he can take advantage immediately with a discovery, knight to d6. I can't take his knight on d6, because my queen will get lost. Bishop takes b5. After my queen moves, he'll take a rook on c8 or e8, and I'll have lost in exchange. A bad position. So the only remaining move is queen on a4 back to c6. But then he has knight c4 to a5, attacking my queen. My queen must move to a square that defends my bishop, say queen c7. Then he takes on b7, knight takes b7, queen takes b7, bishop takes a6. It all ends with a skewer. After my queen moves out of the way, queen b6, he takes my rook on c8, I take back, and I've lost the exchange. He has a rook for a knight. I'm in big trouble. So for that reason, the idea of queen a5 unfortunately loses by force. Knight c4 is a very tough move to meet. So instead, I started to investigate the possibility of a6 to a5. This is a risky move because it plays right into his plan. It weakens the b5 square for his bishop. And his plan of knight d2 to c4 and knight a2 to c1 to b3 is unfortunately not so far away. To make the move a5, I had to evaluate a position a number of moves down the line, and the move involves an exchange sacrifice. After a5, he played knight c1, beginning his plan. And I played knight b8, an excellent move. Now again, we see that my queen on d8 is lined up with his rook on d1. Dangerous, but he has two pieces in the way. He can only move one out at a time. But this move looks like it could lose by force. He can play bishop on d3 to b5, attack my rook. Now if I move my rook, he'll simply move his knight on d2 to c4, beginning his plan, attacking my queen, and I'm starting to get a very bad position, and it'll be his move he's moving with tempo. But my plan here was to play knight b8 to c6. Now the point is that I have a very strong threat to play knight c6 to d4. If he moves his knight on d2 to c4, exposing the threat of his rook on d1 to my queen on d8, things might look bad initially, but in fact, I can play knight d4. I finish my plan of the knight's maneuver from d7 all the way to d4. I move out of a threat, and I threaten his queen. After his queen moves, I can figure things out. Things look pretty good now. That was my plan. Also notice that his e4 pawn has come under attack. By playing his knight away from the d2 square, he'll be weakening the e4 square. So when I played knight b8, my plan was to maneuver it all the way to d4. But if he plays correctly, he can challenge my plan. He played knight c to b3. Knight c6, he played bishop b5, which is correct. I had seen this position when I played knight b8, or in fact, I had seen this position when I played a5. Remember, when I played a6 to a5, I took a very big risk. I weakened all my light squares. I had to evaluate the following idea. Now, if I move my bishop on c5 somewhere, then he'll play knight to c4. Say I play bishop c5 back to b6. After he plays knight d2 to c4, he'll have exposed my queen on d8 to the threat of the rook on d1. And now my knight coming to d4 is useless because he already controls that square with his knight on b3. After he played knight b3, I played the move knight d4. My knight comes into the square. If he moves his queen, clearly it's going to be good for black. My rook will move out of the way, and I'll have accomplished my goal of my knight coming to d4. But remember, a bishop on d4 doesn't do so much. It doesn't hop around. It doesn't seem so brutal. A knight on d4 is what I want, but he can simply take my knight, which is what he did. Knight takes d4. I played bishop takes d4, and here he simply took my rook on e8. Bishop takes e8. And this is the position that I evaluated a number of moves ago when I played a6 to a5, an exchange sacrifice. I took his bishop back on e8. Now take a moment and look at the position. What do you think? The first question is material. That's very easy to calculate. He's up material. He's up in exchange. He has a rook for my light squared bishop on b7. But now take another look. What do you think is the quality of the pieces? My bishop on d4 is very strong. It threatens the b2 pawn, which has to be defended by his rook on b1, and it ties down the f2 pawn, which needs to move in order for his bishop on g3 to come into play. My bishop on b7 is also very strong. I'd attack the e4 pawn along with my f6 knight, and the light squares can become very useful. He has no light square bishop to challenge it. Also, I control the c-file. My rook on c8 is on an open line. Notice that my queen on e8 attacks his a4 pawn. Notice his pieces. His bishop on g3 does absolutely nothing. Also, his rook on b1 is only stuck defending a b2 pawn, and his rook on d1 isn't doing much right now. His knight on d2 is getting ready to come out to c4 and b3, but it can't right now because it's defending the e4 pawn. It seems that black has white tied down. White doesn't have much to do. My opponent defended against the immediate threat of queen takes a4 by playing b3. And here I had to make a critical decision. This brings up a very important psychological aspect of a chess decision. I intuitively had intended long ago to, in this position, play rook c8 to c2. But then I started thinking, my logical mind kicked in. Maybe I should just play queen to c6. I felt that rook c2 was a good move, but then mathematically I started to convince myself that queen c6 was maybe correct. And here I had to make a critical decision. This brings up a very important psychological aspect of a chess decision. I intuitively had intended long ago to, in this position, play rook c8 to c2. But then I started thinking, my logical mind kicked in. Maybe I should just play queen to c6. I felt that rook c2 was a good move, but then mathematically I started to convince myself that queen c6 was maybe correct. How can he defend his e4 pawn? The only move is rook on d1 to e1. But it's a very passive move. Maybe I can keep on going. Queen to c2. This looked very enticing to me. I like this position very much. And this brings about a classic confrontation between one's intuition and one's mathematical logical mind. I wanted to play rook c2, but I found myself trying to convince myself to play queen c6. What I've learned in these situations is to trust my intuition. I saw no problem with rook c2, and I also like queen c6, and this decision to choose one of two very good possibilities is one of the most difficult decisions in chess, because they're both very enticing, and it's hard to part with a good path. But I followed my intuition and played rook c8 to c2. What's the point? For one thing, I threaten his pawn on e4 because the knight on d2 is pinned. Remember the theme of the pinned defender. My threat, knight takes e4. If the knight takes it, my rook will take his queen. The other thing is that a rook is very useful on the 7th rank. I'm sort of a bone in his throat down there. What can he do? He needs to challenge my rook. If he plays queen to d3 to attack the rook, I would play queen on e8 to c6. And now we immediately feel the power of my rook on c2. It can't be challenged. If either rook comes to c1, I simply take it because I control the c1 square twice. I'm also threatening to take the pawn on e4. My bishop on d4 is making it very difficult for him. He can hardly move at all. He's in big trouble. If he plays rook b to c1, I would also play queen c6. Allow a trade of material. Now it's strange to trade down material when you're behind. But I saw that after we traded on c2, he would be in a very difficult position. There's really nothing that he can do. The knight on d2 can't move because my queen will take his queen. His queen on e2 can move hardly anywhere because his d1 rook is hanging. The queen is defending it. The pawn on f2 can't move because of the pin to the king on g1. And his e4 pawn is attacked. He's in big trouble. He's up material but tied down by my lesser forces. Here he played a move that challenged all of these ideas. Instead of rook b to c1, he played rook d to c1. And now I played an idea which I saw immediately before I played rook c2. I played rook takes knight on d2, sacrificing another exchange. It's not often that somebody sacrifices two exchanges for something that isn't very clear. Now I'm down a lot of material. Remember, rook is worth 5, and a knight or a bishop is worth 3. I've given up 2 exchanges, which means I'm already down 4 pawns, which is a lot in chess. It's like being down more than a whole piece. He took my rook on d2, and I played knight takes e4, attacking his queen. Now it's true that he's up a lot of material, but I'm sure you can feel that the quality of my pieces is much higher. My bishop on d4 is anchored. After he moves his queen, which he did, he played queen d3. I played my knight on e4 to c3. Now take a moment and look at this position. What do you think? We both have queens. I have 2 bishops and a knight, and he has 2 rooks and a bishop. That means I have a knight, bishop, and pawn, because he has no e-pawn. I have a knight, bishop, and pawn for 2 rooks. That's a difference of 10 to 7. It's like I'm down a whole piece. But the difference is that the quality of my pieces is much higher. If you look, he's rooks. Rooks operate best when on open files, but there are no open files. I've closed them all down with my pieces. His rook on c1 can't bust into the game. His rook on b1 is attacked and has no decent squares except for, b2 is a terrible looking square. His bishop on g3 still can't come into the game because my pawn on e5 is solid, and his f2 pawn still can't move because the king on g1 will be hanging. What can he do? If he tries to use the theme of giving back material when ahead, plays rook takes c3, then I would play b takes c3, and I would have a very powerful passed pawn. Now I would only be down a bishop and pawn for a rook, which is hardly anything, and I'd be preparing to trade queens with an idea of queen c6 to e4, and to try to make the c-pawn into a queen very fast. Very dangerous passed pawn. He can't do that. Put yourself in White's position for a moment. Think what you would do. You'll feel that it's a very unpleasant situation. My threat, in fact, is not to take the rook on b1, because that would alleviate the bind I have on him. My threat is to play bishop on b7 to e4. After his queen moves to c4, because you see my bishop is defended by my knight on c3, then I would take on b1, and he can't take back, as I would simply take again. I would win a whole rook for nothing. I'm threatening to win a rook in this position. He saw that the trade of rook for knight would be good for him. It would help to alleviate the stress on his position. So he played queen d3 to c4. Strange position. If I want to, I can take an exchange. Knight takes rook any time. But I don't want to. I want to increase the pressure. I played queen e8 to a8. A strange looking move, putting the queen in the corner. But I have a very strong threat. Bishop takes g2. He can't block that diagonal by playing f2, f3, because once again, the f2 pawn is tied down by my bishop on d4. Can you feel the power of that piece? The only way to defend the g2 pawn is by playing queen c4 all the way back to f1. A very passive position. Look at the queen. Now I can take a rook if I want to. Your queen on f1 is doing absolutely nothing. I can slowly build up my position. Maybe I'll try to trap the bishop on g3 by playing f5 and f4. I have a lot of different plans here. My opponent couldn't bear to defend the g2 pawn that way. He gave it up and tried to activate some pieces. He figured that if I took the g2 pawn, he'd be able to use the open g file to attack my king. He sacrificed the pawn and played h3. I played bishop takes g2. So now it's like I'm down 2 pawns. I have a bishop and knight and 2 pawns for 2 rooks. Not so bad. He played king h2. Why did he play that? For one thing, I had a very big threat. Bishop takes h3. After that move, I'm threatening queen g2 mate, and there's very little he can do about it. King h2 defends the h3 pawn and begins a plan of taking advantage of the open g file. He wants to play rook c1 to g1 and try to activate his pieces somehow along that file. And here I have to make a very important decision. I see that white has no real counterplay, because if he puts his rook on the g file, it'll be nice, but no big deal really. What I want to do is I want to maneuver my queen to f3 and my bishop back to where my queen is. Imagine if I had a battery of pieces, queen and bishop, with my queen in front of my bishop instead of behind it. Then queen g2 would be a mate threat. That's my plan, to somehow figure out how to maneuver my pieces for my queen to be inside his position and my bishop to be outside. Then I could really do some damage. Also, of course, it would be very good for my knight to maneuver eventually to the f3 square, which has become a big weakness in this position. But I can't do that right away, because if I move my knight, I'll allow him to activate his pieces with queen c8 check. I wanted to play the move bishop d5. Why? Because the only piece that is semi-active in his game is the queen on c4. The queen on c4 is beginning to come inside of my position. I don't want it to do that. I want to push all of his pieces back and slowly bring my pieces back. I have a dominant game, but I want to play everything perfectly. What would you do with black here? Take a moment and think. What would white play if black played bishop g2 back to d5, attacking the queen? There are 2 options. White can move ahead or white can move back. If he plays queen d3, then I've accomplished my goal. Plus I can play bishop to e4 and double up on the rook on d1. But he has another option. He can play queen to c7. And now suddenly I have a bone in my throat. Queen on c7 attacks the e5 pawn. Suddenly my queen on a8 has the feeling of being tied down to my a5 pawn. He has a very strong threat. I have to figure out how to deal with it. And his queen can't be chased away from that square. It's a very active position. Things can get bad for me suddenly. My position is very good. It's very dominant, but it's also a delicate one. In fact, if you look back, his threat in this position is to play queen to c7. The queen is entering my position, and it has threats. So we know what his plan is, to enter my position with his queen. And we know what my plan is, to drive his queen back, and to eventually take advantage of the diagonal by putting my queen in front of my bishop. What did I play? Can I stop his plan and accomplish my plan? Without the explanation I just gave, my following move may seem a little bit bizarre. The position is one in which I sacrificed a lot of material. I can play knight takes rook if I want to, any time. And I played the move queen a8 to b7. Why? By now you probably already know. Very simple. To take away the c7 square from his queen. This brings up the importance of prophylactic thinking in chess. You would never think of making the move queen a8 to b7 unless you thought, what's my opponent's plan? His plan is to play queen c7. My plan is to drive his queen back. So I can take away the c7 square, and then drive his queen back, and then I'll have a great game. It's very simple logic if you think about what your opponent's plan is. Queen b7 is a very strong move. Your inclination may always be when you're down material to play quickly, aggressively, force things. That's not always the case. You can be down material and still control things. Sometimes you have to play patiently, even after you've sacrificed material. After queen b7, he played rook b2, finally moving the rook away from the threat of my knight. Frankly, I wasn't intending to take the rook, so I didn't really care. His plan is to play rook d2, though, try to activate the pieces that way. It would be very good for him to trade off his rook for my bishop on d4. Maybe he'll play rook d2 and try to take on d4, and after pawn takes, queen takes. If you imagine the trade of his rook on b2 for my bishop on d4 and pawn on e5, the position suddenly has a different feeling. His bishop on g3 has become active. One of his pieces that was cramped is off the board, and my dominant bishop on d4 and pawn on e5 are gone. Now white's game is okay. So it's strange that White's main plan is to give up a big piece for a smaller piece, and Black's main plan is to prevent that exchange. This speaks to the quirky nature of chess. The value of pieces is always changing. Never be dogmatic in your assessments of a chess position. I played my plan, bishop on g2 to d5, pushing his queen back. He played queen d3. And now I used a common theme of repeating the position a few moves. I played bishop to e4, he played queen to c4, and I played bishop back to d5. He played queen d3. Why did I do this? For a number of reasons. For one thing, we were nearing time control. We had to make 40 moves to get another hour on our clock, and I wanted to have less moves to make, for us to have less moves to make, because frankly I like my position more. And when you have a better position, you don't want things to get random so much. Also, by repeating the position, you can often instill in your opponent a false sense of security. If I repeat the moves against you once, maybe you begin to feel, oh, he's only looking for a draw. That makes defending after I play on a little more difficult. You should always seize upon every psychological nuance you can in a chess game. I repeated the moves twice just to make him have a feeling that maybe he will be able to draw, but also to get closer to the time control. Then I played bishop e4, queen c4. Now look at this position. Remember what my plan is. What do you think I played? Remember, I want my queen to go in front of my bishop and to attack the g2 square. How can my queen get there? One possible plan is to play bishop on e4 back to f5, then jump in with the queen, queen f3, and then bishop back to e4. Makes sense. I like the central position of my bishop on e4, and wouldn't mind keeping it that way. Notice also that with my bishop on e4, his rook on b2 can't move that much. If he plays rook d2, I always have the option of bishop back to d5, and then taking his weak pawn on b3. Still, I'm maintaining his position. I'm keeping him tied down. I played queen b7 to d7. Now you see my next two moves are probably going to be queen d7 to f5, and then into f3, headed for the g2 square. After queen d7, he played rook d2. What should I do? I mentioned playing bishop d5 with the idea of winning the b3 pawn. You think that's correct? This would probably be a mistake now. Because of the exchange sacrifice he can play, he can give the material back by playing rook takes d4. Now if I take his queen, he'll take my queen. My bishop is pinned to my queen. I have to take back on d4 with my pawn, and after queen takes d4, the b3 pawn is in fact not hanging because my bishop is still pinned to my queen. Now I have a knight and pawn for a rook. I'm down in exchange. My position is okay, but now his bishop on g3 has opened up and things look okay for white. I continued with my plan, queen f5. What would happen if he played what he had intended, rook takes d4? Let's calculate. Rook takes d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4. I play queen f3, threatening checkmate on the g2 square. There's only one defense, rook g1. And now I play knight on c3 to e2. And white is in big trouble. I'm threatening the queen on d4 and the rook on g1. He plays queen d8 check, which doesn't make any difference. I play king h7. And now white is completely lost. There's nothing he can do. If his rook moves from g1, queen g2 will be mate. The only thing he can try is queen on d8 back to d1. I play knight takes g1. If he takes on g1 with his king, queen g2 or queen h1 will be mate. He has to play queen takes g1. And now all the material has been won back. I can play queen takes b3. I'm up 2 pawns. I have a brutal pass pawn on b4. I can always play queen back to f3, which ties down his queen on g1. I'm completely winning. He's lost. Notice that my whole plan centers around stopping his idea. He never quite has time to alleviate the pressure on his position. I stop all of his ideas and keep on mounting my own plan. This is how to play when you're down material and have a positional advantage. Increase the pressure and play prophylactically. None of his plans can quite work. He played rook g1, defending the g2 square that I was about to attack. I played bishop e4 back to d5. Now he came to his beloved c7 square. But I don't really care about it anymore because my queen has become very active on f5. Now it's time for the next step of the plan. What should I do? If my queen comes to f3, it doesn't have much purpose anymore because his rook on g1 defends the g2 square. But his rook on g1 is tied down to defend to the g2 square. He can't sacrifice on d4 anymore because after I take back, he can't win the pawn. And I'll continue to push that pawn and still have the plan of occupying the f3 square with my knight. But why did I play bishop d5? Your first reaction may be that I wanted to take the pawn on b3, but my plans were nothing of the such. I wanted to keep on attacking his king. Wouldn't it be great for my knight to be on f3? Imagine that. I'd be checking his king on h2, attacking his rook on g1, attacking his rook on d2. His king would have to go to h1 or g2, and then my knight could move anywhere with a discovered check. That would be pretty brutal. But how can my knight get there? The first logical move is knight to e4. Here we have to look at some tactics. Before playing a move like this, we have to look at what his response will be. He obviously planned for it. If he plays queen d8 check, and I play king h7, he has the option of taking my bishop on d5. But after queen takes d5, his rook on d2 is hanging. This actually happened in the game. If he throws in a move of rook takes d4, moving the piece that I would take, then I'd take it back with my e-pawn, exposing the defense of my bishop on d5 with my queen on f5. So, I'm executing my plan while maintaining that the tactics don't quite work for him. He has to give up an exchange and allow me to continue with my initiative. He played queen d8 check, king h7, queen takes d5, knight takes d2. It seems as if for a long time the struggle has been based upon the theme of him trying to sacrifice material and me trying not to allow him to sacrifice material. But here I allowed him to give me back material only in a situation where it worked for me and where I could keep my initiative. Notice I've maintained the bind of the bishop on d4 and pawn e5, and thus maintained the passivity of his bishop on g3. And also my knight on d2 is getting ready to come to the f3 square. Do you see a defense for white? He played king g2, defending the f3 square. My light squared bishop is gone. Now I need to make a new plan. I began by sacrificing 2 exchanges. Now I'm 1 exchange down, but I have 2 pawns for it, so the material is pretty much even. But he's also slowed down my initiative, it seems. I have to make a plan to win the game. Notice that he has a number of weaknesses in his king side. The pawn f2, the pawn h3. His light squares are pretty weak, but he does control the g4 square. If his bishop on g3 moves, the f2 pawn will become very weak, and I can take it, with mate following. I began with knight e4. My threat is obvious. His f2 pawn is attacked more times than it's defended. I can either take on f2 or take on g3 followed by queen f2 check. That will be mate. The only way he can hope to defend the pawn is with rook f1, which he played. Now I played knight g5, attacking the h3 pawn. How can he defend it? If he pushes the pawn h3 to h4, then I win very easily. Queen h3 check, king g1. Take a moment and find the winning move here. The same theme as the first 2 games we looked at, against Luna and Katina. Queen takes g3 check. The pawn on f2 is pinned to the king by my bishop on d4, the pinned defender. His only defense of the h3 pawn is rook to h1. If I want to, I can have his rook hopping around from f1 back to h1, f1 back to h1. He has 2 weaknesses, but unfortunately for me, he can defend against them both. I have to create a third. But there's another element to this position, which is that white can't move. The bishop on g3 is completely tied down to the f2 pawn. The rook on h1 now is completely tied down to the h3 pawn. If his queen moves off of the a8, h1 diagonal, say by taking my pawn on a5, then he'll be completely destroyed by my control of that diagonal. I play queen e4 check, his king has to come back to g1. If he comes back to f1, I take on h1 check, I win the rook. And then I play knight to f3 check. And it's obvious that his days are numbered. If the king comes to g2, he's on the diagonal of my queen. I'll play knight h4 check, followed by queen g2 mate. And if he comes to f1, he loses pretty easily. Take a moment and find the win. I play knight d2 check. He plays king to g1. Now what? If he takes on a5, try to find the win for black. If he takes on a5, he's given up control of the a8 h1 diagonal. I play queen f3 check. If he comes to g1, queen takes g3 check wins clearly. If he comes to f1, I take on h1. And if he comes to h2, which is the only reasonable move, my win is pretty easy. I simply take on f2 with my bishop. My threat is queen takes g3 checkmate. If he takes my bishop on f2, queen takes f2 as mate. He's completely lost. He can't afford to give up control of the a8 h1 diagonal. So if you look at the position, you'll notice that he has very little he can do. I only have to throw a little something into the position to throw him completely off balance. This can be looked at as a position in which it's as if he's a car teetering on the edge of a cliff. If a bird flies onto the hood, it could throw the car over. I played the move h6 to h5. You could ask what my threat is, and maybe it's to play h5 to h4, move his bishop off the g3 square. But what you could also ask is, what can he do? If his queen moves off of the a8 h1 diagonal, we know what wins. But if his queen moves to c6, maintaining that diagonal, I have a new plan, maybe, of playing e5 to e4, forcibly shutting his queen off from the diagonal. Next, queen f3 check will be fatal. The queen can't move at all. If his rook moves anywhere, it's only to the h2 square. And we can look at that move and laugh at it. It's ridiculous. There's nothing for him to hope for there. Also, if his rook moves to h2, I can play knight g5 to e4, attacking the f2 pawn. He doesn't have the option of rook to f1. He needs to play king to g1, which loses because I take on g3. The pawn on f2 is pinned. If he plays king to f1, I also take on g3. The pawn on f2 is pinned by a different piece, my queen. So we see that his queen can't move, and his rook can't move. If his bishop moves to h4, it does absolutely nothing. And also I can play g7 to g5, attacking the bishop. It moves back to g3, and I play h5 to h4. The bishop has to move off of the f2 pawn, and I checkmate him. This is the position of Zugzwang. I played h6 to h5, and he has no moves. Nothing can happen. The only thing he can do is to play h3 to h4, which stops my idea of h5 to h4 and kicks out my knight. But this is the key difference I was looking for. I play knight back to e4, attacking the f2 pawn. He plays rook to f1. What is the difference between this position and the last time we looked at my knight being on e4 and his rook on f1? Take a moment and find black's winning plan. The g4 square is open. I played queen g4. And now we see that his position is finished. What is my threat? First of all, I want to utilize the idea of the pinned defender. I want to play bishop takes f2. His bishop can't take on f2 because of the pin on the king. The only move is rook takes f2. And then I would simply play queen takes g3 check, followed by taking on f2 because my knight defends the piece. And the story's over. My other threat is knight takes g3. After f takes g3, I'll play queen e2 check. He loses a rook. The king can't move anywhere to defend the rook because my bishop controls the dark squares, and if the rook moves to f2, I simply take it and win. Do you think he can defend these threats? He did defend against both of them, but unfortunately he exposed himself to one more. He played rook e1. Now if I play bishop takes f2, my first plan, he plays queen takes e4 check, and I lose. His rook defends the queen, and I've lost a piece and will be down a rook. That would be unfortunate. If I play knight takes g3, he takes back with his pawn, and we notice that he's defended the e2 square. But what we do is we take the space he just left. I don't play bishop takes f2, I don't play knight takes g3, I play knight takes f2. A final idea. And it's all over. My threat is queen h3 check, followed by queen takes bishop on g3. He can't move anything. If his king moves, I'll take the bishop on g3. Take a moment and make sure you understand there's no way for white to defend against mate. Here he resigned and I won the game. A nice sacrificial game, in which I won having a lot of patience within the attack when down material.